Join us in a festival that promises to be extraordinary, because Bali is extraordinary.
Hi everyone, and welcome to UWRF Writers and Readers Festival 2021. This year, the festival returns with the theme Mulat, Sarira, or in English, self-reflection, which is drawn from Balinese Hindu philosophy. From the 8th to the 17th of October, the festival will explore the meaning of self-reflection, in cultural introspection and human rights, examining who we are, what unites and divides us, and what drives our actions. My name is Zoe Gan Rankin. I will be your moderator for this evening. And I'm delighted to introduce my mum, Rose Gan, whose novel, Dragon, the first in the Penang Chronicles, is published worldwide on the 1st of November 2021. The Chronicles follow the life and times of Francis Light, a country trader for the East India Company, who established the first British settlement in the Straits of Malacca on the island of Penang in 1786. Rose is British, married to a Malaysian, and her family live in Southeast Asia. She is a historian who has taught both in the UK and in Malaysia. More recently, she has worked with museums both in Indonesia and Malaysia as a docent, trainer, lecturer, editor, and writer. Rose has been an active member of various cultural societies, including the Indonesian Heritage Society, the Malaysian Culture Group, and the Museum Volunteers Malaysia. The Penang Chronicles trilogy has taken 15 years in the creation and has already received much praise from notable authors in the region. So, today's session is going to take the form of a conversation between me and Rose, interspersed with readings from Dragon. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all the viewers out there. Thank you so much for your interest and your support today. After our conversations and the readings, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask Rose some questions too. So if you have a comment or a question, please drop it into the Instagram and Facebook chat at any point during our discussion. We will take as many questions as time permits. Hi, Rose. Shall we get started?
Let's just fire away.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit something about Francis Light?
Sure. I'll give you the potted history. Francis was born in 1740 in Woodbridge in Suffolk. He was illegitimate, which was going to have quite a big bearing on his life. But he was fortunate enough to be raised by a benevolent guardian who put him through school, a good school, and raised him as a gentleman. At the age of 14, he decided to go to sea, and he joined at a time when Britain was at war with France, which actually served him in his stead because it enabled him over the next 7 years to work his way up until he became a lieutenant, and then the war ended. Men like Francis, who had been promoted through war but were actually of the lower orders, found themselves surplus to requirements, so he was discharged, back on the land, no prospects. So, like many men of his time, he looked east to try and make his fortune. He applied to the East India Company. Again, his illegitimacy becomes an obstacle. He is refused because he's not a gentleman as far as they're concerned. So, not to be deterred, he goes out on his own speed, and he goes to Madras, where he takes himself around the agencies until he gets a job as you mentioned before, a country ship captain. Now, a country ship captain is sort of the lower end of the food chain, if you like, in the East India Company. It's simply that the English and Scottish captains who ran the very small ships on the regional trade, bringing the regional cargoes to Madras and Calcutta. It was a very hard life, and you had to be pretty tough to make a go of it, because there were you all alone on a small ship with a local crew, negotiating through all the small ports of the Straits of Malacca. And Francis must be a quite stern stuff, because he makes quite a success of that, and he makes money. Within a few years, we find he has his own ships and has made this vast network of connections throughout the region. He speaks the languages fluently. He writes and reads in Malay, which is more than you would find for most British, I would imagine. Together with a friend of his, a chap called James Scott, who he had served with in the Navy, the two of them make a really great success of their life as traders. And that might have been enough, but not for Francis. Francis seems to have a need to make his name. Maybe it's something to do with the fact that he's got this burden of illegitimacy, the stigma on his back. So he is determined to become somebody in the East India Company. Now, at that time, the East India Company were looking for a base in the East Indies. They put out this call: can anyone from Calcutta to Canton find us a viable base? Francis thought, I'm the man for this job. So over the next 15 years, he sent one proposal after another, each rejected. The people in Calcutta didn't know who he was, were taking no notice of him. Furthermore, they didn't quite trust a man who was so integrated with the local communities. He was very well respected by local sultans and local merchants, and spoke the languages well, lived his daily life amongst them. It seemed that made him less British in some way, and maybe perhaps he'd gone native. So all those things were actually predicating against him. But he didn't give up, and he kept going and going, making proposal after proposal, until eventually, as we know, one worked, Penang. And we all know the rest of the story. So that's the potted Francis Light, if you like.
Wow. I mean, what you're telling me there is kind of the standard archetypal story of Francis Light. What makes your version and your novel different?
Well, essentially, it isn't different. That is the framework of the story. But I've told that story in maybe 3 minutes. And most books online will tell the same story in 3 minutes, and then the rest of the book is about Penang. Now, of course, Penang is a fabulous story, and we're going to get there one day. But my interest lies more in what was going on in the years we don't say much about. That's the story of Dragon. It's in the early life of Light. It's how he got from where he started to where he ended. Because it is a very interesting story. I mean, he had a really quite fantastic life, full of adventure, full of narrative incident, perfect for a novel. But despite the fact that he has got a very dangerous trade life as a trader, which makes for great adventure, let's think about it. I mean, being at sea was dangerous in those days. There's a danger of shipwreck, storms, pirates, tropical diseases. Despite all those dangers we know of, and the fact that he had to be a very ruthless and shrewd character. We know he did a bit of smuggling on the side, and he was in, there was all sorts of strings to his bow. Despite all that, that is not the main thing that's my interest in telling the story. Francis Light had his fingers on the pulse of the era. He was known to everyone of note, both in the Straits and back in India. And so he's like this conduit that leads us in to the story. Because my real interest is telling the story of the Straits. We know the story of how the British moved in the Straits. That's been well told. I want to know what was going on there, and how were they affected by it, and day to day, what were the problems they encountered. I want to talk about the real characters, the King of Siam, the Sultan of Kedah, Lady Chan of Phuket, people who are kind of sidelined in the British narrative of Francis Light. But I also, and perhaps even more importantly, want to talk about the diverse, rich cultures of the Straits that had always been a factor, because they are just the background to the story. I want to bring them into the foreground of the story. I want to talk about the Straits Malays, the Minangs and the Siaks from Sumatra, the Bugis of Riau. I want to talk about the Chinese traders, the Arab traders, the Indian traders, the Eurasian people. All of these people with different religions, different languages, somehow existing in a sort of uneasy symbiosis for so long, and then suddenly something is going to affect that forever. So that's what makes my story different. Not that the information is different. I haven't found anything new. Historians know all this stuff. I just want to make it part of the story that the general reader has.
Wow. I mean, no doubt Francis's story is a really colourful one. But do we need another novel about a white colonial hero? I mean, should we be giving such figures attention these days?
Well, that's a $64,000 question, isn't it? And I guess over the last year or two, I've had to think about that a lot. There is no doubt that it's probably no longer appropriate to have certain statues in squares and name roads after colonial masters. It wouldn't bother me at all if all the road names changed and all the statues were put in museums. I understand that. If I was Indonesian or Malaysian, I would totally understand how conflicted I might feel about singling out these people again and giving them attention. I'm there already. But what I would like to say is that this thing of cancel culture that is very much a buzzword upon is something quite disturbing to me as a historian. First of all, I don't think it exists. I mean, how can you cancel culture? It's innate in everything we are and everything we do. So no, I absolutely don't think that it means anything at all. But if what they're trying to do is put the unpalatable parts of our story or anybody's story in a box and lock it away and never look at it, well, that's like Pandora's box, and look what happened there. I think that we have got real problems, and those today, and challenges, and particularly in Southeast Asia, most of them, which are, to be honest, rooted in our past, our unpalatable past. So it's time we really opened that box, looked at it, and tried to unpick the legacies of injustice by getting the whole picture, because otherwise, all we've ever read, the average person who's reading, all they're ever really going to have is the childish version of history, which they got at school when they were children, or even more worryingly, the Facebook meme, the one-sided article that somebody sent. We live in an age of fake news. If we don't open the story to the past and look at it on both sides and try to unravel it, we're going to push each other further away. So that would be my main argument about cancel culture. But in defense of Francis Light and people like him, they don't have our benefit of hindsight. They, like many, many other traders through time immemorial, came to the Straits to make money. Francis was a man of commerce. He wasn't a land grabber. The British weren't particularly interested in land grabbing. How ironic that they became the greatest land grabbers of all in the end. But we cannot really hold them entirely responsible for the way things turned, which obviously led to quite a dark time for the peninsula. So I am defending them a little bit by that, because I think it's dangerous to judge people in the 18th century for what we now know in the 21st century.
Well, I mean, that's a really true point. We have to look into the past to understand the failings of the current and the present and the future, I guess. So Francis is a fascinating character. What drew you to him in the first place?
Well, to be quite honest, I wasn't drawn to Francis in the first place. Let me give you a bit of background to this. Well, you know this background, but the audience knows some of this background. About 20 years ago, I really changed my life drastically. My husband, who was a Malaysian working in UK, took a job in Penang. So we decided to relocate. I gave up my job as a teacher, so I took early retirement. And my children, you and the others, were all in university. So I came back to Asia, and it was a period of adjustment for me. Empty nester, loads of time on my hands. And I was drawn, as a historian would, to sort of throw myself into discovering more about the history of Penang and Malaysia and so on. So there's the background. And I wasn't drawn to Light, I was drawn to Martina Roselles. Now, for those out there who don't know, Martina Roselles is the Eurasian lady who was Light's partner for 23 years. Some say wife, although that's a bit of a contentious point. I was drawn to her, and I thought, well, maybe I've got this time on my hands, maybe write a biography of Martina Roselles. But I couldn't, because just hardly anything known about her. And the few things we do know are completely contradictory. So, you know, I dug further and I dug further. And of course, as I'm doing that, I'm finding out more and more and more about Frances Light, not Martina. So therein lies my story. It's not an unusual thing to find that women in the past don't leave a record of themselves, or the record is not kept of them. It doesn't mean they didn't have a life worth noting. Martina clearly had a life worth noting. For a start, she's with a very important man of the Strait, the British colonialist in the Straits, for 23 years. She bears him 5 children who all go on to have significant lives in the British establishment. So obviously their mixed heritage doesn't seem to unduly hold them back. Her influence can be seen in some of the things that Light does. I'm not telling you what, because you have to read the book for that. But when he dies, eventually, he leaves everything in his will. And when she's played out by the executors of the will, she takes them to through the British courts twice. So this is a woman of some character, a formidable woman, a woman who has a very rich story to tell. But how to tell it when we know nothing about her personally? Well, the only way we can tell it, I think, is through the medium of a novel. So that's what drew me to Martina. But there's a kind of underlying reason, I think, and I'm going to go deeper into it, but psychoanalyze myself here. I think I saw a kinship with Martina because of the time of life I was in. I was on some sort of brink of changing my life, and there was a British woman married to a Malaysian man. He's settled down completely in his community again. I'm still, you know, struggling a little bit. My children, who are back home, are having their own issues, because when they're in Britain, of course, my children are British, despite the fact they have Malaysian passports. But not everybody sees them as British. And then they come over to Malaysia and they're completely integrated and assimilated into Malaysia. But not everybody in Malaysia sees them in Malaysia, despite the fact they're Malaysian citizens. So I think all those things were going in my head. I'm thinking, like, this couple, Light and Martina, 250 years ago, how did they handle all this? You know, how did they manage to get through this whole morass of problems of mixed cultures? So I think through that kind of reaching out, I was trying to tell something of my own story. I think sometimes to understand yourself, you need to throw the lens on something else outside, and there's more clarity there. So I think if I psychoanalyze myself, I think that's what really, really stirs me about Martina's story.
Wow, there's a lot. That's a lot to take in there. And I think, you know, it's really bold and very brave, actually, to psychoanalyze yourself in the medium of exploring a book. And I really am interested in Martina now. Is Dragon as much about her story as it is about Light?
Well, no, to be quite honest, it isn't at all. Martina comes into the story in my second novel, this sequel, Pearl, which is out next year. Neither Penang nor Martina feature in Dragon. They are sort of like ideas hovering in the reader's consciousness, like, how's she going to get there? You know, how is this going to happen? They're both of them, the eponymous Pearl of the next novel. But although Dragon is set very much in a man's world, it's obviously the Royal Navy and then the life of a trader, that would be a little bit, I didn't forget women in this novel. In fact, very, very much the opposite. I wanted strong women to feature throughout my novel. And there are several women in this book who, I suppose, in a way, foreshadow the role that Martina will play later. One of them is a power broker in Phuket, a lady who's both a trader and a political figure in Phuket. The other one is a Malay lady of a noble house, a matriarch, an old lady, who is quite a rambunctious character herself. And the third is a lady of mixed heritage, a Nyonya lady, who acts as an ambassador for the Sultan of Kedah. So these three women are all doing things that you would not expect to happen in the 18th century. Certainly, let's face it, if you were back in England in the 18th century, I don't think you'd find many women operating at that level of society. You only have to open, Pride and Prejudice, and you find on the first page, the only thing a woman can do with her life is get married to somebody with substantially more money than she has. Otherwise, her options are not the ones that a nice lady would want. So, you know, this shows there was a sort of level of engagement that women had at that time. They had some power in the society, perhaps more than their counterparts back home. So, this has always been something that's kind of resonated with me right since the very first time I came to Malaysia. When I first came as a young married woman, just out of university, women's liber, with all my ideas about, you know, the ideas of the time. I came to Asia as a young bride, and I expected to find a place that was much more, his thinking was a lot different from what I was finding at home. One day we went to an open house, and all the men went into one room, talking about business, politics, the law, all big topics. And I was shunted into the other room with all the wives and babies. And I thought, oh, it's Asia, what do you expect? You know, these women are just accepting being, you know, the gender roles assigned to them. And then I started to listen to the conversation. And women were talking about business, law, politics, stocks and shares. They were talking about the same things as the men. And then I got to know these women, and they were all professional women, actually high flyers, way above me and any corporate ladder, who in their public life worked side by side with men and probably were their bosses. But at home, they were quite happy to accept a sort of traditional gender role. And I had some trouble with how did that work, because that wasn't really how it was back home. In the East, there's always this sort of yin and yang thing. Somehow, in Eastern philosophy, they seem to take quite opposite positions and marry them quite happily. And I think I wanted to make sure that was in the book, this sense that women were not without agency in this time, even the poor women. I mean, if your husband was a fisherman, you ran the stall on the dock. And if your husband was a farmer, you were in the market every day. If your husband was a trader, you were selling the goods. So these women were fully integrated into the commercial life, even though they obviously also had to marry and have babies and all the rest of it. I know that I'm not trying to make it out that this is a wonderful idyll for women, because there are some massive issues of gender inequality, even now in Southeast Asia, as there are in everywhere in the world. But societies have different way of coping with it. And as I know as a historian, whatever time in history, whatever culture you go and look at, women have always found ways to intrude themselves. They found their power. And I wanted to tell the story of that power. And Dragon does tell the story of that power just as much as anything else. But I also wanted to talk about biases, because I was very biased when I came. But the bias goes both ways. My mother-in-law, wonderful woman, a formidable woman, the breadwinner for the family, but she confided in me many years later, your grandma, I didn't really want you to marry my son. I mean, we all know that British women are selfish, lazy, don't understand filial piety, don't bring children up properly, don't care about education. She had all these myths about the West. And of course, through me, she had learned that they were really ridiculous. They were stereotypes that were not applicable to everybody. So my book's about biases. It's about those East-West, West-East biases, but it's also about the biases everybody has within Asia, because all those different cultures, they all have stereotypes and myths about each other, which when they get to know each other, all fall away. And that's, of course, back to the old question, is the more we know, the more we can separate all, you know, the rubbish from the reality and really become integrated people together. Which kind of brings me in very nicely to my first reading, which is going to be read by a woman of the Straits herself, Julia Hartmans. And the reading comes from a part of the book called The Nyonya Lady. And in this part of the book, the Nyonya Lady, an ambassador from the Sultan of Kedah, is meeting Francis Light for the first time. And she has got some very strong assumptions about him right from the get-go. So, a Nyonya Lady.
The dilapidated Atap house was set in a shabby compound within walking distance of the muddy dockside, from where the fetid stench of rot, decaying fish, and human waste wafted on the sea breeze. It was a forlorn place, a few chickens pecking the dusty earth, a stray dog foraging in kitchen refuse. Lady Tong Li suspected it was a place of men. She could see no evidence of a woman's hand. Even a slut would keep more order in a home than this. The residence surprised her. Her knowledge of European ways was scant, mostly gleaned from gossip and stray observation, but she carried a notion that white people lived grander lives. After all, they strode around as if they owned the world by some God-appointed right, disdaining the very cultures that they sought to plunder, treating the people of the East like primitive children. She had been curious to meet this young Farang captain who had been well regarded by her late husband. Martin Roselles had thought him a fine man, unlike the other stiff and prejudiced company officers, less venal than Scott, whom her husband had liked but always viewed with a healthy measure of mistrust. Yet Captain Light lived here in squalor. It puzzled her. Did he not consider his reputation? Did he not wish to save face? How would his business acquaintances in the Sultan's court regard a man who did not seek to impress with an outward show of wealth and prosperity? They were strange people, these Farangs, and they smelt. A young Malay houseboy ran out to greet them. He was friendly but displayed little notion of courtesy or respect. "Selamat datang. What you want?" Lady Tong Di waited in a cluttered room that seemed to serve both as living and dining quarters. An open door revealed an unmade sleeping cot in a tiny annex, to the right of which was the kitchen, set on the back veranda. She could smell onions and spices frying and hear the sizzle of hot oil as pungent tamarind was thrown into a kuali. She considered sitting, but every chair was occupied with papers, items of clothing, and other random objects. So she decided to stand. The boy had disappeared through the only other door, which he had closed firmly behind him. That must be Captain Light's private chamber. Was he still abed?
Wow, that was a beautiful reading by Juria Hartmans. And what I find so fascinating about is seeing that kind of duality of the biases that you mentioned before in that passage. I just really love the truth grounding in that sequence then. Anyway, let's get back to exploring the book. How much of Dragon is fact and how much is fiction?
Well, surprisingly, a lot of it is actually fact. In fact, some of the most hard to believe episodes, probably the ones that are fact. There is actually a lot more known about Light than perhaps most people realize, but it's scattered all over the place, and most people are not looking for it. Historians, of course, have this story. But inevitably, there are massive gaps in what we actually know. And so the author of a novel has to fill in those gaps to make the picture whole. To do that, I tried very hard not to invent too much. So I went to other anecdotes and to things that had happened to other people to give it a sort of truth and reality that it might very well have something similar like that happened to him. But a lot of the anecdotes we have about other people are in the diaries and letters of English people who were over there, and they're often written in a sort of amused way about, oh, these people over there are so primitive, and there's like children really, and they have some very odd ways, and it demeans, I think, the local communities a little bit. So I took some of these sort of episodes, these stories, and sometimes I flipped them and saw them from the other point of view, that of course something quite different was going on in the heads of the other people. There's one particular famous story told about a 17th century Englishman traveling in one of the Indonesian islands, and he's at the court of the Sultan. And when he's there, the Sultan offers him a betel quid from his mouth and pops it into the Englishman's mouth. And the Englishman then has to, obviously, because it's a sign of welcome and hospitality and friendship, he has to chew it. And then he writes about this in, I don't know, a diary or a letter later. And it's kind of like quite mocking things we have to do with these primitive people, So this episode I wrote in my book. It happens to Light. Something similar happens to Light at the court of a sultan. And yet Light knows full well that that's not what's going on in the sultan's mind. It's not because he's some primitive tribesman who doesn't really understand things. In actual fact, what he's doing is testing Light's mettle. He's sort of saying to Light, do you understand my culture? Do you know how important this is to me? Are you prepared to grovel before me for this prison steal? Because, of course, the Sultan, who's been a trader himself, because, of course, they were all involved in this trading world, a shrewd politician, he can handle these people. If these people want to work with me, they jolly well better follow my ways and obey me. So it's in moments like that you think, I'm taking something that happened to somebody else, but showing it wasn't some amusing incident. This was something that meant something quite differently to the other side of the story. But inevitably, there came places that I had to make inventions, and most of them are not very significant, but there are 3 really big inventions. One of them is my bad guy in Dragon, who is a very one-dimensional bad guy. He's an invented character, and I hold my hand up. He's no good qualities, and you're meant to dislike him. He's the bad guy with a curly moustache that you're supposed to, hope something bad happens to in the end. The second sort of invention is the character Solomon. Although he is actually a real person, Solomon did exist, but I only know of him as an older man. I've invented his childhood and youth, and I've made him Light's adopted son. Now, that's a big, big jump, because we have no evidence that Light had an adopted son. But other in English characters or European characters who were in the Straits often adopted local people or had very close mentors from amongst the local communities. Raffles had his mentor, Munshi Abdullah. Magellan had Enrique of Malacca, and Russell Wallace adopted Ali. So I took that kind of trope about them having a mentor, and I wrote that into the story of Light. But apart from the fact that I wanted to show something about Light's vulnerability through his adopting Solomon, I also wanted to have, for Light to have a mentor from the Malay community, somebody who could actually guide him as the reader is being guided through this new world of the Straits, teach him the languages, could interpret the cultures and so on and so forth. And also, as he grew, would start to have his own identity issues, because he had to find himself as a Malay again, because he spent so much time with it. So that's why I invented Solomon, to give us this other insight. The third and largest invention, of course, is about Martina, because we had so little concrete evidence. I have invented a backstory, a family tree for her. Now, Martina is said, and this is why I say that the story is very conflicting, she's said to be either a Siamese lady, a Malay princess, or a Nyonya lady, which is a lady of mixed heritage. Well, most people say, well, she can't be all 3. Well, maybe she can. So the backstory I've invented for it is to relate her to a real person from Phuket, and because of their family tree, would enable her then to be all those 3 things. And purists may say, well, that can't have happened. Well, I agree. She probably wasn't related to that family, but she was related to some family. And I believe she had all those parts to her. And that is where the stories came from, because, and I think it's our story too, people of mixed heritage, of which there are so many in this part of the world, have different parts to themselves. If they are with their Chinese relatives, they're Chinese. If they are with their Malay relatives, they're Malay. If they're with their British side, they're British. They can sort of present themselves in quite different ways, and there's no lying. It's just what they are. I believe that's what Martina was, but I had to invent that thing, and it gave me not only a way to make that story believable, but it also gave me a way that I could further bring us all into the real personalities of the Straits by making them even closer to Francis Light by relationship, obviously. So that's my fact and fiction answer, really. As much fact as I could possibly get, but inevitably some fictions.
Wow, so much of that resonates with me in terms of the complexity of identity and working it out and unpacking it. So it's really evident that so much research has gone into writing this novel, for both the fact and the fiction. Can you tell me a little bit about that process? I'd really be interested to learn more. Well,
obviously, it's a lot of research. I mean, you said I had this idea 15 years ago. I had the idea 20 years ago, really, but not the idea, but I was doing the research, and it's taken a long time. In some ways, because I'm a historian, the research becomes an end in itself, and I was really in danger of going down so many rabbit holes I never got out, and I never wrote anything down. So eventually I had to rein myself in and get to the actual writing of the book. Yes, of course, there's a lot of research. I have a bibliography which has over 100 titles on it, of books and scholarly papers and stuff like that. But there are many other things you have to look at if you want to make a real world, because scholarly books, they're dealing with the big themes. They're not dealing with the sort of human side of stories. So how did I piece together the human motivations and little details about life? So for that, I had to go really a very wide scope. I used letters a lot. There's lots of Light's letters to obviously the East India Company and to other captains, but also to sultans, because he wrote Jawi and read Jawi, to people in Phuket, to his girlfriends. So you even get that other sign, and he did have a lot of girlfriends. But then there's all these other areas like diaries and newspapers and maps, portraits, tombstones, wills, Burke's peerage. It's just literally all over the place. One area that I got really fixated on were naval archives. I'm a real geek for stuff like that, and there's a wonderful internet site called 3decks.org, which is amazing. It has every detail about the Royal Navy, the American Navy, and all the European navies over a 400, 500-year period. Any ship you put in, it tells you everything about it. You could write a book just following the data on that. So yeah, there's like really, it's very random all over the place. But one thing I did use, which I think is a really important thing for a novelist, is I used other novels. I know that novels are not resources. They're not sources. They're not didactic. But you can learn a great deal from them if it's a well-researched and well-written novel. And one of my really great, I'm a really great fan of the novelist Patrick O'Brian. Now, if you don't know him, he wrote Master and Commander, Far Side of the World, the Jack Aubrey novels. 20 over them. I've read all of them. They're on my bookshelves. I defy any naval historian to know more about the late 18th and early 19th century Navy than Patrick O'Brian. I have just simply, you just live the world in his novels. So I think some of the early chapters of my book are kind of an homage to him and what I learned from them. So yes, novels too are very, very important for giving you that real context for the past.
Wow. So your inner nerd is very strong. I can see that.
Yes, I think you know already.
Yeah. I'm really interested to know, like, how important is historical accuracy in a historical novel, from your perspective?
Well, it really depends on the genre. Historical novels, there's all sorts of them. And I don't expect all historical novels need to conform to the sort of that kind of background of research. For example, if you're writing a historical romance where the past is just the framework for it, Outlander type of thing, I love it. You know, it's great fun. But I know as a reader that, you know, it's not about the historical facts. People are going to say things they wouldn't have said and act in ways they wouldn't have done. This year's Bridgerton, everybody saw it. Everybody loved it. We know the past wasn't quite like that, you know, and that's fine. And I'm not a purist about that. I don't get snippy about those things because that's exactly what they're supposed to be. But if you're writing a literary novel about real people and real events, I think that is very, very different. You know, people may be dead 250 years, but that doesn't mean to say we can play fast and loose with their lives. We owe them a debt to honour them and honour the truth of their stories. We cannot use an event in history just to make our story more titillating. It's a serious act. You know, we cannot take somebody, oh, this person is going to be my hero. Oh, I've just found out he did something really terrible. I just won't have it in my novel. That doesn't work for me. You have to be true. You have to find a way to get it in. If the facts are troublesome, tough. You're the novelist. It's not an easy thing to do. Make that well-rounded person show all the sides of him, even the ones that you don't want, you know, the unpalatable truths. So I do think in that sense, we must honour the past by telling it as true as we can. We can't always be 100% true. And I know that there may be some things in my book that are not true. And maybe I made a mistake, and I hold my hand up and it's my mistake. But you try as best as you can. When I was writing the book, well, I went to Penang many times, but I did go to Penang last year when we were allowed to, when the borders were open for a while. And my husband and I went to Northern Road Cemetery, where Light and James Scott, his friend, were buried. And I took 2 roses, and I was going to put the roses on their graves. I couldn't get in because they padlocked the gate. I don't know, it was a COVID regulation or something. And I was furious. So I went round the corner and managed to find a place where the wall was down. I would call this the Indiana Jones part of my research. So I climbed into the graveyard, ran through the long grass, put my flowers on the graves, took photographs, and then I said a prayer, or maybe it's a promise, I can't say which, that I would honor their story. I wouldn't make them heroes if they weren't, but I would tell it as true as I could, to respect them. And, you know, when at times when I was writing, and many authors say this, you've got your plan and you know what you're going to say, and sort of like an invisible hand reaches over and you find your stories going down avenues you didn't expect. I don't know, but maybe Francis was helping just a little bit. I'd like to think he was. So yes, historical a must for this kind of book, as far as you are possibly able.
Well, wow. I really like the juxtaposition between your inner nerd and your Indiana Jones historian. That's a really great image in my mind now. I think we're going to take a pause now.
Yes, I was just going to say I should probably introduce my second and final reading, which is by Andrew Rankin. This is from much earlier in the novel. It's called A Wider Horizon. And the chapter is about when Francis first went to sea. Now, he's 14 years of age. He's down in Portsmouth with his benefactor, William Nagus. And I think I wanted to end up with realizing that these men who came east, they went as young boys on ships. Who knew whether they would ever come back again? So it is quite an adventure for them, and it seems a good place to end. So A Wider Horizon.
Exposed on the gunwale, buffeted by a fierce blow, the man and boy stood side by side and took in Portsmouth Harbour. The expanse of sea and sky, a wider horizon than Francis had ever dreamed possible, stretched out in every direction, crowded with ships and crafts and men and buildings. Beyond them lay the sea, reaching ever onwards to the ends of the earth. The vast distance in time and space, who knew where and who knew what end. For the first time, the prospect of leaving never to return crossed his mind. He glanced over at his guardian, wondering if perhaps they might never meet again. Equally awestruck by the sight and feeling similarly apprehensive, William took the boy's hand in his own and gave it a reassuring squeeze. A rare moment of sentiment from bluff Squire Negus. Quite a sight, eh, boy? After months of waiting and planning, anticipation and regrets, the day had finally dawned when Francis Light was to embark upon his chosen career. He had travelled down to London the week before in the company of his guardian to visit outfitters and be kitted out for sea. Then a mail coach to Portsmouth on Sunday, and a night at a decent inn. It would be a long time before Francis next slept in a bed. So a little comfort and a good dinner were in order. Francis was bewildered by the sheer enormity of the world beyond his quiet little town in Suffolk. After 14 years in Woodbridge, then London and Portsmouth in the space of a few days, it was almost too much for the boy to assimilate. The swagger and confidence that had seen him bid farewell to his friends and family had disappeared over the past few days. Now at the point of embarkation, he felt very young and not a little scared. It was a dull and gloomy spectacle for all its majesty, a seascape dominated by greys, dirty clouds that raced impossibly through a lowering pewter sky, the surge and slap of oily charcoal water against the stone walls of the wharf, the iron-grey masts, a skeletal forest creaking and groaning, for all the world like baleful spirits clothed in pearl-grey shrouds, wailing out a warning. It was a scene of foreboding, not the stuff of seaboard fantasies the young boy had cherished these past months. To make the morning even more miserable, drizzle was now falling like an ashen mist, casting the dismal scene in an even murkier light.
Wow, that was a beautiful reading. Well, a deeper and darker reading, so to speak, from Andrew Rankin there. So this takes us to the point in our session or in our conversation where we're going to have a look at the questions that are in our chat, both on Facebook and Instagram. So if you just give me 1 second, I'm going to have a little look here. Okay then. Right, we have a couple here now. The first one is from one of our audience members asking us about writing. I guess we've got a lot of budding writers in the audience, as it is a writers and a readers festival. So they're asking, can you share your experience and maybe give some hints on how best to approach publishers and agents? I think it's a really great question. Over to you, Rose. Well,
Unfortunately, the first and most important lesson is you have to face that rejection will happen. I first wrote a novel 20 years ago, which nobody published. I sent it to many literary agents and it didn't get there. But although I threw it in the bottom of the wardrobe, I did learn from that experience. And I knew that if I ever did it again, I would go about it in a different way. What you need to realize is that when you're writing a book and doing all this research and living your lonely life and introverted life in front of your laptop, you're now moving to a different stage. You're now going out into the world, to the world of publishing, and it requires as much research to get a book published as it does to get a book written, and a whole new set of skills. It is absolutely no point flirting letters everywhere and just hoping one falls on the right desk. You have to target. You have to really find out who is likely to be interested in my book. If you want to find out how who you might aim for, look inside books, look at the acknowledgements, see who is the literary agent, and then look at their blogs and websites and really read what their interests are. And then you're not wasting time, you're going to the right people. Now, I was told not to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. When I sent this book around, Monsoon Books was the first person I sent it to, because I was really sure this was the kind of fit that I needed. But I did send it to a few other places at the same time. None of the others accepted it. Most of them didn't even reply. So if I hadn't had that, I would have been one of those rejected, still trying. Of course, you only need one to take you, so I was quite happy with that. Once you do get your book published, everything changes. And I don't know if that's my experience with Monsoon or whether it always happens, but I've just had the most wonderful experience since then. Phil Tatham at Monsoon Books has just been the most wonderful mentor and support to me through the whole process. And it is a different process. I had to learn so much, which I hope will make me a better writer in the second and subsequent novels. He has been my guide, holding me by the hand through it all, and he's done everything over and above what I've expected. So it is worth keep trying that mix. I regard Phil, who I've never met because of COVID restrictions, as a friend now, and I think that's the kind of relationship you do build up when it happens. But before that, before you're even trying to find a publisher, you need to put your book out to other people and ask for criticism, and listen, and don't be upset. I mean, your friends will not like to hurt your feelings, but sometimes they just make a random comment, and then you go back and you think, Almost every time that happened, and sometimes there were actual corrections where I was wrong, and that's very, very important that you take that on board. But those criticisms make you stronger, make your book better, and it's a wonderful experience. It also gets you used to being out in the public arena. But as my old dad said at the end of the day, if you are out there listening to this and thinking, I'd really like to get my book published, do not die wondering, is what my old dad used to say. Finish that book and get it out there. And face that rejection if necessary. But if you've got that need to put your work out there, you should do it, and don't give up. Don't let rejection or all these other things, or people telling you it's impossible and nobody ever reads books these days. Do it. I'm 66 and I'm just starting a new career, and I think it's wonderful.
Oh, well, I think it's wonderful too, and I think I'm probably one of your biggest fans. Okay, let's have a quick look at the questions. I think we might have time for just one more because I noticed the time is ticking away really fast. Okay, right, I'm just going to choose this one. Somebody said, why dragon? Why choose this title? Come on,
it's a good
Rose, tell us a
question.
bit
Well,
about that.
once you've read the book, you will know, because it's explained in the book. And I'm not going to give the whole of that story away, but basically, the dragon and its sequel Pearl are two halves of the same story. And they go together. The dragon and pearl is a very popular motif in Chinese ceramics, but it's very, very widely found in Southeast Asia on textiles and all sorts of other places as an artistic motif. And basically in Chinese philosophy, the dragon, the fiery male, chases the pearl around the sky. And that's sort of the cosmos. It's what keeps the balance of the universe. So we have the British and light, the fiery dragon, chasing this elusive east, the pearl, which they're trying to capture. And so that's the reason for it. There was also the kind of feeling in the background that if the dragon ever did actually catch the pearl, which never happens in mythology, then what will happen to what the world as we know it then? So maybe that is a presaging the colonial era. So dragon, that's what it means.
That's wonderful. And now that actually makes sense. The cover of the book, the dragon and the pearl on there. I mean, the dragon and the pearl never catches up to the pearl. It's like a never ending or an infinity loop. Okay, then. So I'm just going to, we're coming close to the end now. So thank you everybody for bearing with us. What I want to just talk everyone through right now is where you can buy the book. So we've got from the 1st of November, but you can pre-order it now. It is available on all major bookstores and e-book platforms, including in Indonesia, Periplus, in Australia, Dimox, in Malaysia and Singapore, Kinokuniya, in the UK, Waterstones, and then worldwide, bookstores, online bookstores like Book Depository and Amazon. So if you're at the moment thinking, oh my gosh, this book sounds amazing, where can I get it? You cannot get it yet, but you can pre-order it. And I have pre-ordered it. Watch out, friends, for all of my friends' Christmas presents. So, I would really, really encourage you all to do that. But we are coming to an end now. And sadly to say, we will be signing off in a minute. But before I go, I would really want to take this opportunity to thank you for your support. Or thank you for supporting, more importantly, the Yayasan Mudra Sawari Saraswati Patrons Program. And also thank you to the festival partners who have made Ubud Writers and Readers Festival possible. I also want to do a big shout out to all our viewers this evening and to the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival themselves for giving me and Rose this time to introduce you to Dragon. And finally, huge thank you to Rose for sharing a few golden nuggets of information about her soon-to-be-released novel. I'm sure our audience is as eager to get their hands on this book as we are to talk about it. So for now, it's goodbye from me. I'm Zoe Gann Franken. Over to you, Rose.
Thank you, everybody. And I know there are people tuning in from all parts of the globe and getting up very, very early in the morning in America to see this. So I particularly want to thank them for it. Your support is so precious to me. It's one of the actual few silver linings of the COVID nightmare we've been through, that opportunities like this to share a book launch worldwide have been made available. Nevertheless, I hope it never happens like this again. I hope next year when I launch Pearl, I'm launching it in Ubud, and loads of you people out there are here to share that moment with me. So thank you, and we're going to finish now. Don't switch off, not quite ready, because we have one little treat left for you in store. So hold on and wait for this. Bye, everyone. Thanks very much again.